You're listening to Story Struck. I'm Rachel, an editor and writing coach.
And I'm Nino, a ghostwriter and book coach. Welcome to our curious community where we dive into everything books and writing.
Now, let's get into the episode.
Okay, now today's episode is about the impact of fiction. This is one of my favorite, most excited about topics when we started brainstorming topics for the podcast. This was the one I'm like, oh, I can't wait to talk about it. So I'm so glad we're talking about it like right away. So what do you think, Rachel? What do you think of the impact of fiction?
Yeah, so I think that most of the times when we think about books having an impact, our mind automatically goes to nonfiction, right? Where it's helping you to create change in your life. It's talking about a topic that is top of mind in the world, whether it's, economics, health, personal development, all of those types of things, that we forget that fiction can have like just as strong or maybe even a deeper impact on ourselves and how we respond to the world around us.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, because of going through the school system, we think about learning in that nonfiction way because that's kind of how we have moved in the world for most of our lives. And although absolutely nonfiction has its role, people be sleeping on fiction, like people are sleeping on fiction on how impactful it truly is. And as I think like when we think about the psychology of story, we can see why. So, as the one who is all educated in psychology, do you want to tell the listeners why story impacts us so significantly as humans?
Yeah, so when we read stories, we get really immersed in the characters and in the world, and this can serve multiple purposes for us. So it can be a form of escape where the story lets you get away from what's going on in your own life. You could use story to process what's going on in your own life, and you could use it as inspiration for what you want to do. So there's all these different points of entry that we can do when we read fiction, and they will come at different points in our life. And you may be reading one book for escapism and another book for inspiration at the same time. Like it's not a linear thing that you have to go on. And story, like we've told stories since the dawn of time. That is how we've learned to grow and adapt in the world around us. And it is how we have formed connections as humans as well, of that storytelling where we had oral traditions before we ever had written history. And then that's translated now into the written word.
Yeah, and Lisa Cron in her books talks about how the story helps you bypass your logical mind. So when we have like this barrier, we have an objection to this certain way of being, this certain outcome in life. We have and then we go and we read a story. It bypasses that objection that we have built in there, so we can try on this other reality. We can try on this other perspective, where if it was just said to you straight out or in a nonfiction way, that objection would have been like leaned into harder. And I thought that was
He's like, whoa.
I thought that was yeah, the dog just bolted. So I thought that was a really amazing way to look at. Oh, and the cat just came to visit. All right. To look at story, and it makes a lot of sense when we think about, folklore and fables and mythology on how that is how we taught children, right? The modern way of teaching is very disconnected in a lot of ways to the way humans have learned for most of our experience, so most of our human history. So having this very analytical way is actually kind of against the natural grain of our brains, and maybe why um, our more neurodivergent kids have such a hard time in schools now, because it's not put into this kind of storytelling format as often. And um and so you had said something really interesting, because like my thought with like fables and folklore and mythology is that there are these stories that teach us these lessons, and stuff, but then you talked about how they're also teaching us our our how to keep us in line.
Yeah,
So
it's like
talk more about
outdated
that,
lessons.
please. Yeah, yeah, because I'm like,
Yeah.
I didn't even think of that, and that's just like so true.
Yeah, so now, like before we started recording, we were talking about like Icarus and how they were like, he wanted to fly too high to the sun, and then, the wax melted and he fell back down to earth. And if we look back at the time period of when that was written, it was very structured in society of class systems, and like you could not climb out of your class and go above. And so like when I reflect on that, and this is just my personal take on it, I feel like it is trying to tell you don't aim too high because you'll crash and burn, right? And but back then that's kind of what it was, where now we are encouraged to aim for something higher because we can attain that. We are not stuck in that very rigid system now where there are more things accessible to us than there used to be. So some of these fables maybe were put in place to scare us, like Hansel and Gretel, right? The fable of, listen to your parents and don't wander out and don't do these things. Like, obviously, yes, we want to be safe and listen to our parents, but um, we don't need to have like this fear factor that I feel like a lot of fables just instilled. And we need to encourage that confidence to try and experiment with new things.
Right. And if you look at, like any old story revolving around or that has a witch in it,
Hmm.
usually the witch is painted out to be old, ugly, alone, and evil.
Yes.
And it's just like, because the idea of a woman not having a man was so repulsive to the culture of the time. And so that way, therefore, there must be these things wrong with her. And based on our beauty standards, based on our, patriarchal society, based on all of these things, these must be the things that are wrong with her. And therefore, she must be evil because she
Yeah.
doesn't fit in. And so then you think about like, okay, and then not only is it teaching the children don't go into the woods and take candy from strangers, but also, uh, what is it, Gretel, like, don't make sure you marry so you don't end up like this old hag,
Don't turn into the
right?
witch. Yeah.
Yeah, don't turn into the witch. Make sure you go and find yourself a husband ASAP, like, and a lot of those old stories are like that. Um, and a lot of the stories really put women in their place. And, now we have a lot of these retellings coming up. Have you read Circe?
I have not.
Oh my God. So, to my knowledge of Greek mythology, Circe doesn't have a ton of stories. She's got a couple, um, and she's this powerful witch goddess, and stuff, but she doesn't have like, she's not one of the big ones that get a whole
Okay.
lot of stories, a whole lot of connections with everyone. And this one connected all of those pieces. So it has like the main stories, right? With like, she has one where she turns these men into pigs and stuff, like, but it connects it all. And it's this big, beautiful story arc of like what builds to why Circe is like that. So we don't just have this image of Circe that just hates men and wants to turn them into pigs. We have why she turned those men into pigs. We have all of the buildup of her life and how far she had come to that point, and why those men were turned into pigs, and then where she goes from there. And I think that is how, we have started to grow as a society, taking on and seeing through some of these stories and identifying the impact that these stories have had on us, our lives, throughout our life and throughout generations of our lives, and stuff like that. And so, now we're having these people do these retellings or these expansions of stories. And I think that is so profound and reflective of how far we've come, because we know that stories give us a lot of context on what society thinks of us and stuff. And I always just think about like Disney movies. You have like the generations of the Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and Snow White and stuff like that, but then you have the other generation of the Mulans and the Megaras. It's just like, because little girls were moving, like we were evolving past that. Like the Snow Whites and the Cinderellas were just not hitting anymore, because after generations of this kind of storyline being pushed on us, we were pushing back. It's like, no, these are not our stories, so I think that that's really interesting how we have impacted fiction, but then also, because of the impact fiction has had on us.
I think something else that's interesting is that we're seeing a lot more in books where we're getting like the villains side of stories, but then also getting to see like fiction books come alive so much more when the antagonist is completely well-rounded and has substance to them. Because you know me, with my psychology background, I love character development. And you don't want to have just a flat, boring villain, right? Like, if I just had a bad guy who's just a bad guy, then who gives a crap? But if I have one and I can see, like, in his mind, why he's acting this way, you can almost feel for him. Like, if we even just think, not a book, but back to Marvel, right? Like, we have Thanos, who's a bad guy, but we get to see the evolution of why he thought that way, and that he thought he was doing something for this reason, that there was purpose and good, even though it wasn't good for everyone else around. So when we have that fully fleshed out character, we get more invested in a story, but we can also empathize to some degree with the villain. So it just kind of adds more heart and more substance to a story when we have the protagonist and the antagonist both be fully fleshed out characters.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's so funny that you brought up Marvel, because the first character I thought of was Shang-Chi's dad. I can't remember his name, but in Shang-Chi, his dad was what I thought was just like such a well-developed, fully fleshed out villain that you almost want to root for.
Yeah.
Like you're almost on his side, but you're also like, no, dude, you need to chill. But you know what I mean? And it's those types of villains just bring that depth to the story, because it also, and how that it impacts us, is when we have villains in our stories, right? We all have a villain in our life, right? Our villain throughout our life story. And those villains are usually not the Jafars of the world. Those villains are usually not just straight, awful, terrible people.
Yeah.
Usually those villains are complex. Usually those villains have these traumatic childhoods or these traumatic events that happened in their life, and they chose the path of destruction of others instead of a path of supporting and healing and loving others and stuff like that. But usually they are, like the hurt people thing.
Yeah.
And so seeing those types of characters in books, on screen, in stories, helps us to see those characters in real life, because not everyone's going to be a blatant bad guy. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes they're going to be a little bit more covert and complex, and you're going to feel for them because you know that this childhood was really awful for them, and you know that that's why they're doing that or this or whatever. But it's still like, you have to stop them, right? And I think about like, you like, Shang-Chi is such a great example, because his dad was doing all these awful things, and
Yeah.
he knew that that these things his dad was doing was rooted in his past. He understood the past, he lived it. And but he still had to hold him accountable. He still had to stop him for the sake of his safety and the others, safety of other people. And I think that whenever we have those times in our life, seeing that type of thing on screen helps us to apply that same like boundary setting. You know, maybe we don't have to use superpowers and a dragon to defeat the bad guy, but maybe we come in with some serious boundaries with a parent that just really needs some therapy, you know?
I think it like also helps us to have a little bit of empathy for, whatever this, antagonist is. And like when I like say that, I don't mean that we have to accept what they're doing is okay or good. Just kind of like, if you have a trauma in your past, you can quote unquote forgive someone for it, but it doesn't mean that you have to accept it and say that was okay. But you can choose to like be like, okay, I'm gonna release that and let it go, because it's not worth my time and energy to dwell on that. Like I can still hate you forever, but we're letting it go. So I think having that empathy and understanding where they came from, just can help us to process things that are happening in our life too. So like I had a character that I was developing for a story, and initially I was like, oh, well, he like wants his son to follow in the family path, and he's acting like this and acting like that, and he's kind of a jerk. And I'm like, oh, but maybe he actually truly does love his son, but he's acting like a jerk because that's what he learned from his father. But his father actually didn't love him, and he's like, well, I want to do it different, but he doesn't really know how to do it different. So he thinks he is, but he's doing the exact same thing to his son and just passing that along to him. So it's just kind of interesting when you dig back into that, because otherwise you could just look at this character in my book and be like, what an ass, right? Like, oh
Right.
my God. But now you're like, oh, wow, he's trying to build something better for his son. And he doesn't realize that he's instilling that same toxic nature that his father was doing. It's coming from a totally different place in him than it was from his father. And it just makes the story so much more well-rounded. And it also makes us look at our lives and see, oh, wow, maybe that's something that's happening in my life. Maybe I'm doing that and I didn't realize that I'm doing that, or
Yeah.
that's what's happening to me. And the book can be a place for you to, like you were saying, you try on those hats and you are safely able to observe what happens in there and kind of take that on. And then maybe that will spur you to take action in your own life and have a conversation with somebody about something.
Yeah. And I think with whenever we're writing stories, having um that place of, I lost my train of thought. Yep. It just completely flew out of my head. Oh my gosh. When we're writing stories, having the basis of what kind of transformation or what type of scenario somebody might want to try on, I think is so profound as a writer,
Mhm.
to enable, have that in mind going into the process, right?
Yeah.
Have that whole like, okay, these are people writing this book, and we do this with nonfiction a lot, right? We think about our audience and like, okay, who is this book for, and why are they reading this book? And so when we're doing like a ghostwriting project for a nonfiction author, right? It like that is one of the very, very first things we do, and we don't always think of that when we're writing fiction because we're just writing a nice story. But when you come at fiction of like, I know that this is impactful, this is activating for some people, this is going to help change somebody's life, this fiction story, then we can integrate that transformation
Mhm.
within that story. So whenever they are that person who's reading that book and they are in that sandwich generation where they've received this lack of love, lack of support, and maybe even abuse from their parents, and they want to do it differently for their children, but they're in this weird limbo spot because they love their child and they want their child to succeed, but in their mind, because they haven't unfucked themselves, they're then actually still doing the same thing to their child, but maybe in a different package or whatever. They're able to
Mhm.
see themselves in that character and then realize, okay, well, so and so in the story got therapy, and then maybe that plants that seed of like, okay, maybe I need to get some therapy, read a parenting book, or like figure out how to do something different, because like they see the character does something different. Like that's the catalyst that makes the relationship better in the end, is that he read this book. He finally picked up one of those books or whatever. And that's what started him on this path of change that healed his relationship with his son, or whatever. And that when we're coming in as writers, we can use that same thing as like almost a healing technique that we're weaving into our stories for our readers. Because like with my book, I wrote my book for the outcasts, for the black sheep of the family that is often used as the scapegoat when problems happen, right? When shit hits the fan, oh, it must be so and so's fault.
Yeah.
So and so mentioned this, so it must be their fault, And I saw those ties within Loki's mythology, and so I decided to add context to those stories, and do a um, similar to like Cersei, where it's like we're filling in the gaps of the mythology and building a reason why. So we're taking this person who's been villainized and we're giving the reader context on why they have been villainized and what the true story of their story is, kind of thing, right? And so with that, I immediately went in knowing exactly who it was for, because it was for a very specific person in my life. And they were constantly the scapegoat. Anytime there was a problem, must be their fault. Anytime something was like the least bit off, they were being awful. They were being this terrible, terrible person. And so they were always villainized. But they're the most kind person who's always looking out for like, okay, how does this affect other people, right? They're just like so kind and compassionate and very and so it's just like no matter what they did, it was always going to be wrong. And what I
Yeah.
want them to do is to embrace being the villain in someone else's story and do what is right for them and what is right for the people who love them. And so like the whole story is built out to help people like them to leave these narcissistic situations and come into their own power and being okay. Because like when you're dealing with a narcissist, you're always going to be the villain. You're always going to be the villain. And that's why they prey on the very sensitive, empathetic, compassionate people, because they will be willing to take the bullshit. And so for those people to come into their power and to be like, oh no, I'm okay with being the villain here. Like when the narcissist comes out at them and says like, well, you're terrible in this reason, you're terrible in this reason, they can be like, yep, okay. And then they can move on and do the things. And so like, that's why I wrote the book. And so I think it's just, that's the power that fiction has, is that we can read something and it can activate something in us. And then that activation has that domino effect, that chain reaction, and you know, can really help to change our perspective on things. And I think, like you said, with like the fables and the mythology, like we're seeing that now in fiction, where people are taking tropes and they're turning them on their head. And to change the narrative, because for centuries it's been this narrative that women have to be this way, that classes have to be this way, and now we're changing it throughout our storytelling. Hollywood just hasn't caught up yet. I gotta beef with Hollywood.
So I think also that I don't want writers to feel like intimidated, thinking that they have to go in with these massive deep messages or intentionally thinking about putting these things in, because yes, there are books like yours where you had that deep intention. But no matter what book we write, there is always an underlying theme and journey that a person goes on, right? We have like the hero's journey. And like even something like, before we get into like more of like the heavy hero's journey, we have like lighthearted books. We have, you know, like romance or cozy mystery, chick lit, things like that, right? They're not meant to be heavy, but there still is a transformation and an experience that the person has in that book, whether you're providing them just that like fun escapism that they just need something lighthearted. Even if it's a lighthearted book, there is still a change that that character has to go through from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. Otherwise, there's nothing happening and there's no point in reading it. So your message and your like theme of the book, you may not have even planned it, but there is one there, and it's going to have an impact on the reader. So I think it's always important for us to think about that and remember that. It could be a simple little thing of, I just want people to learn how to put more joy in their life, or it can be something more deep rooted like yours of, you know, coming into your power and like, you know, learning to not have to deal with that narcissism and things like that. So yeah,
right.
and I think
that was part of my inspiration for the book. But at the same time, I think I'm of the opinion that books are channeled, like that books come in and we just like kind of filter the information through our little noggins, and that you never quite know what you're putting in that book that's going to really hit with somebody, that's going to really resonate with somebody, because they might just be this person who feels completely invisible in their life, and they pick up your book and they read this character and they feel seen for the first time because they see themselves in that book. And you never know what that's going to do for a person, you know? And it can be something as small as that. Or like people with anxiety have a tendency, well, I guess, you know, some people with anxiety will read horror or thrillers because it's a way that they process their anxiety. It's giving context to the underlying fear that they have, just lurking within them all the time. And so this gives them context to attach it to. And I mean, like, writing a bunch of thrillers or horror, you would think that, oh, no, this isn't doing any good in the world. It's just like silly horror things, or, you know, it's just these awful things, right? You think of Stephen King books, and I think that's a great example. But some people need that in their life in order to process the feelings that they're having, and then like so they can function in the rest of their life, so that anxiety doesn't go and rule their whole life. They're processing it through these stories. And so everything has some sort of impact and connection. We just don't always know what it is, and you just have to trust the process and trust that flow, and that it is there for the right people, and that the right people will find it. So
beautiful. I think that is beautifully said. That like sums up this whole conversation in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we could probably go on forever about this topic, because I think we both really care about it, and also it connects to so many different things, right? It connects to the psychology of characters, which is an episode that we're going to do. It connects to, like, we can connect it to why books are being burned, and talk about Fahrenheit 451, and talk about like the political reasons why there's a restriction around books and stuff like that. Like we can
There's
go
so
into so
much,
many
yeah.
things. We
Archetypes,
will,
hero's journey,
yeah,
yeah, so many things to explore in future episodes.
yes, but that's why we have like already like 3 years worth of episodes planned, and every time we do something or talk about something, we're like, oh, we got more to add. So but hopefully with this episode you've received something, you can pull something for your own stories, or from your own stories, from the books that you love, and see how they have affected you. Because I know I've had a lot of books, fiction and nonfiction, literally change my life. So hopefully you can listen to this and really reflect on what those books are for you.
And I would say that'd be a great challenge to kind of leave with everybody, is to take a look back and either like the last couple books you read, or like your top couple books you've ever read in your life, to think back on that and think, what did that book give you? Kind of why were you drawn to the book at that time? And what did you walk away feeling after reading that book? And I would love for you to like put it in the comments below and kind of share that with everybody. I think it'd be fascinating to see all the different books and lessons and things that people have experienced.
Yes. Add to my TBR. I need a longer one. Because like to hear about more books that I just don't know of, and to hear like the transformation that it created in somebody else would be amazing. So yes, I agree. Put it in the comments, email us, do something. I want to know. I want more books. So well, until next time.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you for listening. Check out the show notes for details and links from the episode. And don't forget to subscribe and follow for more. Special thanks to our composer, Micah Silverstein. Enjoy the rest of the music.